Okay, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Very good morning, if it is morning. Today we are going to continue with the new lecture, which is going to be definitions of arguments. This is going to be the second chapter in your textbook. So if you have your textbook, you can use your textbook. Just go to the next one. All right, so before we start with what we are supposed to do, we are going to go into the preview of what we are going to discuss on for today's lecture. So basically, we are not going to touch much, just a few. We are going to talk about the definitions of what an argument is. Then we are going to go into what is an argument. Then we are going to go into statements and the four things you need to know about statements. We are going to go into rhetorical questions, then odd imperatives, and identifying premises and conclusions. So everything here is related to each other. So we need to go step by step in order for you to understand the last idea of a premise and a conclusion, which will notably going to create an argument. All right. So first of all, let's go into the definition of arguments. So basically, argument is a claim defended with reason. So the idea here of an argument is to persuade other people to agree with what you are thinking or to agree with your idea. So arguments are not supposed to be neutral. That's the main point. It's not supposed to be neutral, but it is supposed to express a certain position. So when you are arguing on something, of course, if you think about it logically, you should have a position of why you're arguing on a certain fact. So that is what it means by you're not supposed to be neutral, but you're supposed to express what you're thinking in a certain position. All right. So the structure would be assertion of an opinion, thesis, or conclusion that has a clearer committed bias, and a summary seeks agreement for own conclusion. All right. So what is an argument? The basic understanding of an argument is a combination of several things, which is going to be premise and conclusion. Well, if you have one premise and you have a conclusion, that constitutes an argument, but it can be more than one premise and it needs to have only one conclusion. So meaning to say, it can be several sentences, but these sentences have to include a conclusion and one or more premises. So that is the basic understanding of what an argument is. All right. So premises are statements in an argument offered as evidence or reasons of why we should accept another statement, which is the conclusion. And the conclusion is the statement in an argument that the premises are intended to prove or support. So what is happening here is that you have a certain claim, and that claim is going to be your conclusion. And based on the conclusion, you are going to come up with support, and these supports are going to be your premises. So meaning to say, if you have one conclusion, you might or might not have, you might have only one premise, or you might have more than one premise in order to support your conclusion. So that is what constitutes an argument. So it is a combination, simplified version is a combination of a conclusion and one or several premises. All right. Now, statements, on the other hand, would be premises and conclusions, and the general term of premises and conclusions would be statements. So statements constitutes both premise and conclusion. All right. So a statement is a sentence that can be viewed as either true or false. So the basic element here is that you can ask yourself whether it's true or false, and you can use the phrase that it is true that blah blah blah, or it is false that blah blah blah. Now don't get caught into the idea that statements are only sentences which are true, because statements constitute both. It can be true, it can be false. Sometimes the sentence or the statement is clearly false, but sometimes it can be clearly true as well. So in that sense, we are not looking into the idea of whether the statement is true or whether the statement is false, but we are looking into the idea that the sentence is a statement. So some examples of statements are, for example, red is a color. That is obviously true, but again, we are not looking into the idea of whether it's true or false. We are looking into the idea of whether a certain sentence is a statement. The second idea is Canada is in South America. Well, is that true? Search for it later, yeah. The third example of a statement is going to be God does not exist. And the fourth statement can be abortion is morally wrong. Now, if you look at all these statements here, as I mentioned before, some are clearly true, some are clearly false, and some are controversial. But being given that, it's not a matter of whether the sentences or the statement is true or is false, but these are statements because you can ask yourself on the question of whether it can be true or whether it can be false. So that is the basic idea of what a statement is. All right. Now, moving on to the next slide, there are four basic things which you need to understand about statements. All right. So the first thing is sentence may be used to express more than one statement. So if you have a sentence, sometimes it may comprise of maybe more than one statement. So for example, the idea of roses are red and violets are blue. Well, in this sentence, you can see that it's only one sentence, but you have two distinct statements in this sentence whereby roses are red and the other one is violets are blue. And each of this statement is considered a statement because it is capable of standing alone as a declarative sentence. So what this means here is it can stand on its own and it has its own idea based on that statement. All right. So the first one, as I mentioned before, just to recap, is that a sentence might have more than one statement in it, depending on how you see it and depending on what it really means. All right. Now, second, statement can sometimes be expressed as a phrase or an incomplete clause rather than a complete declarative sentence. So what this means here is sometimes in a sentence, you might not have one whole perfect sentence. Sometimes you might have phrases or incomplete clauses which can perfectly be a statement. For example, with mortgage interest rates at 30-year lows, you owe it to yourself to consider refinancing your home. So if you look at this idea over here, what is happening is the first part of this sentence is a phrase. It's not a complete sentence. With mortgage interest rates of 30-year lows, you put a full stop there. It's not a complete sentence. It makes sense, but it's not a complete sentence. However, if you look at, you break it down into understanding that sentence itself, you can actually create two different statements from this, whereby you owe it to yourself to consider refinancing your home. That is going to be the first idea. And the second idea, the second statement is going to be mortgage interest rates are at 30-year lows. So those would be, if you break it down, two different statements which can stand on their own. So the fact that we have to rephrase the sentence slightly to make it explicit should not change the fact that this sentence have two statements. So you need to understand that it has two statements first, all right? Okay, so the third idea regarding statements is that not all sentences are statements. That is, sentences are either assert or deny, that something is the case. So what is happening here is that sometimes when you have a certain sentence, it might not be a statement. Remember, when we talk about statements, we are talking about the idea of whether the statement is true or whether the statement is false, or it can fall under that assumption that it can be true or false. So if you ask yourself, what time is it? Now, that is clearly a question. Can you ask yourself whether that piece of sentence can be answered, can be questioned through the idea of whether it's true or false? Obviously not. Why? Because it's a question. You have a certain answer to it. There's no indication of what time is it? Is it true? Is it false? It's not logical in a sense, right? So if you look at the second idea, hi dad, greetings. So when you have greetings, hi dad, it does not conform to the idea of whether it's true or false. So comments would fall under the same category. Close the window, that's a comment imperative. So when it is an imperative, you're asking someone to do something, please close the door or close the door. Well, that is also not a statement. Why? Because you can't ask yourself whether it's true or false. Request, please send me your current catalog. Proposal, let's go to Paris for our anniversary. Instruction, insert tab A into slot B, or exclamation, oh my goodness. Now, for all these examples, clearly you can't really ask yourself on whether these answers to the question of whether it's true or false, because and that is why these would not be statements, because ideally none of them asserts or denies that anything is the case. All right. Okay, so let's carry on. Now, the last one would be statements can be about subjective matters of personal experience as well as objectively verifiable matters of fact. So, for example, I feel a slight twinge in my left knee. Now, this is a statement because although it is a personal experience of someone and it is basically just someone's, as I mentioned, personal experience and how he or she felt, it can be placed into the idea of whether it might be true or false. So I can be false in a sense that I might be lying and other people may not have a way to verify whether I'm telling the truth or not. However, some statements that look like, some sentences that look like non-statements are actually statements and can be used in arguments. All right. So let's carry on. Now, there are also sentences which falls under, well, maybe questions, can be questions or imperatives. But although it's a question, it is still an example of a statement. Why do I say this? Because if we go into the idea of rhetorical question, the idea of rhetorical question is that it is a sentence that has grammatically a form of a question, but it is meant to be understood as a statement. So it means that it is not really a question whereby it is asking you to answer to that piece of question, but it is actually implying that the person who is giving you this rhetorical question is implying something. For example, yeah, if you look at the idea of Elisa, should you quit smoking? You should quit smoking. So that is obviously going to be a statement. And if you go to the second part of this argument, don't you realize how bad that is for your health? Now, if you go into the idea that don't you realize how bad it is for your health, you are not actually asking for the other person to answer to your question of whether it's yes, I do realize, or no, I don't really realize with that. But ideally, you are implying that it is bad for your health. All right, it is implying that you are telling the person that it is bad for your health. All right, so this is considered a rhetorical question because number one, the person isn't really looking for information. When I say that don't you realize how bad that is for your health, I'm not really asking you how is it going to impede your health. That is not a question, but I'm implying that it is going to impede your health, right? Number two, the person is making an assertion that smoking is very bad for one's health, as I mentioned before. And number three, this assertion is offered as a reason or premise to support the conclusion that Elisa should quit smoking. So if you look at this example here, everything constitutes as an argument because basically you have one, the conclusion, the first part of the sentence, and two, you have the premise, the second part of the sentence, which is in a form of rhetorical question. Although, ideally, if you look at the structure, it looks like a question. It is not really a question, all right? So going on to the next example of a sentence which does not look like a statement, but it is a statement, is an odd imperative. So an odd imperative is a sentence that has the form of an imperative or command, but it is intended to assert a value or odd judgment about what is good or bad or right or wrong. All right. So the idea here is that imperative, on the other hand, first of all, imperative would be sentences which implies that you need to do something. All right. So for example, if you have a look at the previous example, close the window. So close the window is an example of an imperative because you are asking the person to do something, which is close the window. Now, the idea of odd imperative here, just to simplify it, is that it sounds like it is a command. It seems like it is asking you to do something, but it is not actually asking you to do something. It is actually a statement with an assertion of something. All right. So if you go to the idea, to the example of do not read beauty magazines, they will only make you feel ugly. Now, in this, the first part of this argument, do not read beauty magazines, am I actually telling you not to read beauty magazines? Is this Mary Schmidt, hopefully I got it right, asking you not to read beauty magazines? Think about it. Not read, right? This lady is not telling you not to read beauty magazines, but the speaker is actually implying that you shouldn't read beauty magazines. All right, you shouldn't read beauty magazines. So although it looks like a comment or a suggestion, ideally it is considered a statement because it is an odd imperative. Okay, so the statement that reading such magazines will only make you feel ugly is offered as a reason to support this value judgment. All right, so let's move on. So in order to tell a sentence that looks like a comment or suggestion is really an odd imperative, we can ask ourselves, number one, can we accurately rephrase a sentence so that it refers to what someone should or ought to do? So if we can, then ideally the sentence should be regarded as a statement. So for example, yeah, close that window, soldier, it's freezing here. So in this context, the speaker is issuing an order rather than expressing a judgment. So ideally, for close that window, soldier, it's not going to be an odd imperative because it's not really a statement, but it is an order. It is a command for you to do something. All right, it is a command for you to do something. But if you look at the second example, whereby don't blow dry your hair in the tub, Bert, you could electrocute yourself. Now, if you look at the first part, it seems like an imperative. It is an imperative, but this is what we call an odd imperative. Why? Because the idea of this guy telling Bert not to blow dry his hair in the tub is not really asking the person it's not really command the person to not blow dry the hair in the tub, but ideally it is expressing the idea that you shouldn't blow dry your hair in the tub. So there is a difference here. This is not an order or making a mere suggestion, but it is expressing an idea that he should not be doing something. Thus, it should be important to consider the context in which the expression is being used. So you look at the context first, understand the context, then understand why the sentence is being used. So from that, you would understand that it is going to be either an imperative or it's going to be either an odd imperative. Okay. So basically, imperative sentences are not statements if they're intended as orders, suggestions, proposals, or exhortations. So they are statements if they're intended as pieces of advice or value judgments about what someone ought or ought not to do. So basically, that is to recap the idea of imperative and odd imperative. So basically, there are two types of sentences which can fall under the idea of not a statement, but in terms of meaning, it can be statements. So just to recap, those two ideas would be the first one. The first one is going to be the idea of rhetorical question, and the second one is going to be odd imperative. Okay, so for these two ideas, for these two sentences, these two ideas, although they do not really, they don't really seem like statements, but in meaning wise, they are really statements. Okay. Now, let's go into the idea or the last part of what we're going to do for today, identifying premises and conclusions. So when we look into identifying premises and conclusions, there are ways of doing so. First one is going to be indicator words. So indicator words are words which we put in front of either a premise or a conclusion. So when you have examples like what you see on the slide here, the idea being given here, since, because, for, given that, seeing that, on all these what we call indicator words, if you have these in a sentence, they can be examples that indicate that these might be either premises or either conclusions, depending. Now, what is being given here would be examples of premise indicators. So when you have these ideas here, it's going to form premises. All right. So if you look at the examples here, the following examples illustrate the use of premise indicators. Having fun can be the spice of life, but not its main cause, because when it is over, nothing of lasting value remains. So when you look at the idea of because here, you would know that whatever comes after because would be the premise of this argument here. All right. So when it is over, nothing of lasting value remains would ideally become the premise, because you have the idea of premise indicators. And also, if you look at the second sentence here, since effective reasoning requires reliable information, and you have the second part of this argument, it is important to be able to distinguish good sources and trustworthy experts from less useful ones. You have the idea of since in front, because this is a premise indicator that whatever comes after since should be a premise. Okay. All right, going on to conclusion indicators. Well, conclusion indicators, on the other hand, would be indicators which points that the statement which comes after the indicator would be a conclusion. So these are some common conclusion indicators. You can read it here, for example, therefore, thus, hence, consequently, so, according, and you can read the other indicators which you have it on your slides. So let's go into some examples. So the first example would be, there's probably no God, so stop worrying and enjoy your life. So if you look at this sentence here, you have an indicator of so. So when you have the word so here, whatever comes after this indicator should probably be a conclusion of this argument here. So similar to what is being given in the second example, your life is what your thoughts make. This is why it is important for all of us to guard our minds from unhealthy habits of thinking, habits that hold us back from what we should or we could be accomplishing. So you have this is why, and that is an indicator of, that is a conclusion indicator. And after this would be a conclusion, or the conclusion of this argument here. All right. And also, you should bear in mind that when we talk about conclusion indicators, it's not always the case that this conclusion or premise should have indicators. Sometimes in sentences, you don't really have indicators, but it depends on the meaning, yeah? It depends on the meaning. So say, for example, if I take this one out, the first example, there's probably no God. If I delete the idea of so, I go to stop worrying and enjoy your life without putting the idea of so, the indicator of so, it is still going to be an argument, and it is still going to comprise of a premise, which is there's probably no God, and a conclusion, stop worrying and enjoy your life. So indicators would be good ideas to help you guys to detect what the conclusion is and what the premise is. But if you don't have these indicators, say for example, the example I mentioned just now, the first one here, if you don't have the word so, it is perfectly fine, because the meaning still is intact in terms of stop worrying and enjoy your life is still going to be the conclusion of this piece of argument, and that's probably no God is going to be the premise of this argument. So conclusion indicators and premise indicators are not necessary to indicate that it is a conclusion or a premise, but it is a good idea to have this in order to make it clear. That being said, if you don't have this, it is not a big problem. It is not a big issue. So sometimes, you know, when people use sentences or when people argue, they don't really have indicators. Maybe it's their style, maybe it's their way of using words, their way of coming out with arguments. But even so, you should not neglect the fact that even if you don't have indicators, it can be conclusion and premises. All right, so that is the end for today's lecture. I'll see you guys next time around. Thank you very much.